Okay, welcome to our first workshop of the spring semester. And we're going to work on a very fundamental skill in art history, which is visual analysis. It's really a set of skills, but as I'm sure you're aware in your classes, it's really at the heart of what we're doing as art historians, where we start to approach works before we jump into any research, before we start considering various sorts of context. We really need to look at the work of art itself. So I thought we would start with a work from the St. Louis Art Museum, which is where I spent my graduate career. So I'll just open it up. If you want to offer some observations about this work, and try, if you happen to know the artist or the work itself or have any other contextual information, I'd like to encourage you to set that aside for a moment and take a look at what you see. Where would you begin?
I think that I would say that the piece looks very busy, but not in a bad way, just that there's a lot going on, like the overlapping of the lines, but also there's only primary colors used, which there's not, like, you don't see green or purple.
Right.
Yeah,
orange. Got the red, blue, and yellow, black and white. There is a lot going on. How would you describe the way forms are arranged in, we'll say, the picture frame, so the square of the painted canvas?
everything is compactly put within that square, but I also notice a lot of it is going vertically instead of horizontally. And while there are some shapes, they tend to mostly be pointy. You don't see many round circles or anything like that. And some of them, I am looking at the title a little bit. Some of them do look like music notes in that way, the black lines.
Yeah, definitely. So wondering if there's any more to be seen with this closer look. I realize it's difficult virtually to have a closer look, but I tried to bring in a detail of the work. I open up the floor to both of you.
Hello as well.
Hi.
So sorry I'm a little late.
That's okay.
But right now we're just doing a visual analyzation.
Yeah, we're taking a look at just observations before we dig into more of the specifics of what visual analysis is. I thought we'd take a look at a work of art first.
Well, something that I noticed off the bat is just the lines are very, like, nothing about it seems intricate in a way that's formal or anything. Like, they're not clean cut, they're not straight. It's really just lines doing whatever. And I feel like that it brings a lot of, like, it makes it feel like it's moving. It makes it feel like there's a lot to look at. You try to follow the lines and get caught up in other lines. So it's like your attention goes, like my attention goes a lot of ways and then brings it back to the colors.
Definitely.
So it makes it feel like it's in motion.
Yeah, that's great. That's great shift from something visual to its effect on you as the viewer, which is definitely part of visual analysis. So how would you define visual analysis? Feel free to take a stab at it.
I would say a visual analysis is just your interpretation of using sight. So just what you see from the image and what you gather from that message.
Yeah, great. Yeah, it's taking what you see as a viewer, so the form of the work, and thinking about what effect that has. Tanisha just did that with the kind of busyness and the movement and the unplanned seeming pattern of the lines. So the analysis itself takes something, your evidence is what you see, whether that is color, whether that's scale, anything of what you see, and you use that to show its effect, to argue for its effect. And so sometimes we're quick to jump from seeing something and connecting it to something outside of the picture frame, whether that's, oh, you recognize the style of this particular artist and it makes you think of their other work. And it's easy, our brains are working, overtime visually when we see things, and they're trying to make connections. And so what's important is to slow this process down in visual analysis and think, what is it that makes this feel busy? What is it that reminds me of another work by this artist or another artist? What visually is that connection based in the form that we see here? So if you want to think about it in another way, like making an argument where your evidence, exhibit A, is the color in this work, or your evidence for whatever your interpretation is, exhibit B, is the line. So that's a kind of a simplification of it, but essentially that's what you are moving towards as an art historian, is first looking and spending a lot of time with works of art, and then working towards making an argument based on what you see. So it's hard to dispute what you see. So you want to stick with what is really there within the picture frame, whether that's a two-dimensional work of art or something three-dimensional. Now, just so you know, this is a work by Norman Lewis. It's called Twilight Sounds, and it's from 1947. I don't like to show work without telling you what it is eventually. So let's look at one of the first categories. There's a whole bunch of areas you can explore in visual analysis, but one area is composition. So thinking about what and how things are arranged in the work of art. So for example, we'll look at a work together, but let's look at this first question. Is there a focal point, and what does the artist emphasize? And take the next work of art, also from the St. Louis Art Museum. We'll talk about who did it and what's it called, when it was made a little later. So kind of set that idea aside and think about what you see here. So again, this question of the focal point and what the artist emphasizes. Any thoughts here?
My attention automatically goes to the portion of the work that isn't the same, which is the lifted part right there.
Yeah.
And it kind of like puts your focus there as to like, okay, how does this affect what the piece is doing?
Mm-hmm.
And like, what is it? Like, it's not clean cut like all the rest of it. It like it just creates a difference. And
yeah,
I was gonna add to like the definition of like visual analysis that it's like feels like a dialogue of the piece, but it also initiates a dialogue within yourself to kind of just ask why or so what to a lot of things. So I feel like for this piece, with it being a focal point, you ask like, okay, but why isn't it the same? Why isn't it clean cut?
Yeah.
I get.
I like this idea of it being a dialogue. That's great. And bringing in a little bit of context that might make this even more interesting. This particular work, the artist gave any space that's displaying his work, he gives them free rein for how to hang it. So this kind of choice made here was a choice by the museum, by the curators, by the art handlers. So it's interesting because it's showing how so much of this is about how we interact with the work itself. I think we can look at further things in composition here. So thinking about if the composition is crowded or varied or repetitious, there are figures, and how your viewpoint affects your understanding. Any more you two want to add to that? If not, it's okay. We'll go ahead, Gabrielle.
I was going to say that the choice to put the fold or the wrinkle at the bottom draws my attention a lot more to the bottom of the work instead of focusing on the center, which is something that I tend to do. And
Mhm.
so I feel like it also brings us to think more about what this piece would actually physically look like in the space because we're looking at it through a picture. It gives me an idea that it's a lot more structured um, than like the fabric I was imagining it to be.
Yeah. Yeah, it changes a lot of our focus, and so much of that has to do with composition. And in this case, it's not that the artist hasn't considered composition. I think it's more that the artist has given the viewer a more active role in the composition, or less the viewer, more like the intermediary between the viewer and the artist. So that would be the museum and the place in which this is displayed. So it's an interesting question for this particular work. What about color? Should we think about the kinds of saturation of color, if it's bright, if it's very dull, if it's naturalistic or expressive or arbitrary, maybe the source of color in this particular work, and the overall values. Anything you want to add in here?
I think that colors say a lot about like a feeling or an aura.
Mm,
And for this, it gives a lot of like browns and red, very earth tones. Um, and because of its composition, the way that it looks, it really reminds me of like the Grand Canyon or something
mm,
very naturalistic,
yeah.
um, something very like grounding,
Mhm.
something like earth element. So that's what I get from it.
Yeah,
Oh,
or something like, yeah, the Grand Canyon or Monument Valley, it's all out of that same kind of color palette. It's nice. What's how is color, the word applied is kind of interesting here, which we'll get into when we talk about the material, but how is color arranged in this work?
The colors are very stratified, you know, clumped into lines.
Mhm.
And I feel like that gives, like was what was being said before, that gives it a very natural element because it reminds me also of soil and clay, which are also layered like that. So,
Yeah, definitely. Well, that leads to a very interesting question because the way the color and the composition are arranged um, leads us to have these kind of evocations of a natural world, yet the material in this is perhaps not of the natural world. Let's take a closer look and think about what this material might be. It's a bit tricky because it's not a typical material um, that you might just know offhand.
it looks very like not hand woven, but like a cloth material, but it also looks very stiff,
Mhm.
like a wood mixed with some type of like like what is that, threading, like a wooden threading or something like that.
Yeah, you're on the right track for sure. Good, good detective work through your visual analysis. Do you have any ideas, Gabrielle?
yeah, I agree. It looks very stiff, but also like it was woven. So I was thinking it could also be like some type of, I don't know. I was thinking maybe plastic too, because I've seen people weave stuff out of plastic before.
Yeah.
So that would be my other guess.
Yeah, you guys are both on the right track. And this is not one I would expect anyone to just know. But so this artist uses as his material in a lot of his work um, basically pieces of aluminum from like liquor bottles and drink bottles or cans that he takes and folds into these uniform size pieces that are woven together with copper wiring. So you're totally on the right track where it looks woven, because it is, but it's just a harder type of material than we typically expect with like textiles being woven. And then these tesserae of the different metal are arranged in sort of a pattern, very much like they would be if it were a textile. It just happens to be a lot harder, but still not as hard as another type of material. So it's still workable with the copper wiring. And so if we look at some of the questions, that brings up a lot of really interesting ideas about how the artist is handling this type of substance. Why perhaps might want to ask questions like why choose this material, which is a question you can ask even when it's a more kind of traditional art material like oil painting. Why oil painting and not watercolor? Why gouache instead of tempera? Things like that. You can still ask that question. It's just a little more at the forefront of our mind, perhaps, when the material is something kind of unexpected like this. Something that applies a little less for this work is thinking about how you see the mark of the hand of the artist. So see tool marks like pencil marks. In my period of study in the Renaissance, we're often looking for like fingerprints on drawings and things. And part of that is because it was so long ago that we kind of cling to these marks of the artist as evidence to prove whether this work is done by this artist versus another, versus their workshop. But some of it is also, I think, this desire that we all have to connect the work to its creator. So this is an interesting example because it's actually pretty much designed so you don't really see the hand of the artist. And to add a little context to complicate this observation further, you might ask, well, like, how did the artist weave all this material together? It's a lot, and it's a complicated process. Well, this artist happens to have a very big workshop, so he's not always in there weaving these tesserae together. So another thing to think about more for sculpture or for a little more kind of textural painting is if the surface is highly polished or rough. Those are just some questions to get that started. Let's think about space. Now this work is certainly not fully two-dimensional. It's three-dimensional, but it's not sculpture in the round. So thinking about space, you have to get a little creative and think like this still actually is relevant even in a work that's two-dimensional, hung flat on a wall. So there's no figures in this work. So let's think about modeling. We'll think about light. And here's another view of it. Now you notice that it's hung differently this time. It's hung on a wall that's a lot shorter. So more of it's draped on the ground. So we might think about space as we look at this installation view. Any thoughts?
I think having the light directly facing it, you can see that it's much more shiny, especially in the corners, which I think having now known the material makes that just adds another element to think about. And yeah,
definitely. Yeah, you can see even in this shot, you actually see the lights installed. So it shows the way the work is exhibited in the space, but also the space within it. Anything else? Let's look at our list.
I also recognize how much space it takes up, how large or wide it is. So I'm like knowing like that might have been like a challenge for the installation.
Yeah.
And then figuring out like how you want to drape it, being that there's so much leniency for the curators to decide that. And with it being a big piece, like there's a lot of choice that comes with space. I feel like that kind of, well, at least for this piece, it kind of works with composition. because you're having to be intentional about and consider it takes up a lot of space, and you get to choose how you want it to look.
Yeah.
So like it's a lot to process and consider still a piece.
Yeah. Yeah, it's great. I mean, I think you both are seeing how much there is just visually with the work of art itself. And we're not even through all the categories you can use to analyze works. We've started to touch upon size. I think you can tell this is a very large piece. So size is thinking in itself how big it is, but also in relation to the viewer or to the artist. So thinking about the relationship to human scale. I have an image here. You can see another installation shot, a little different than the other two again. And you can see that how big it is compared to the viewer. So another thing to think about, and I want to emphasize the difference between size and scale. So scale, you want to think about is relative size. So think about how it's used within the work itself. So how would we talk about that within this work? How would you talk about scale not related to the viewer and to the artist, to the final piece, but within the piece?
I think like in relation to the piece, knowing the relative size of it, knowing like what you want, what portions you want to take up how much, and what that may look like for the overall like back to composition of the piece.
Yeah.
And it's a lot of, it seems like it's a lot of space to work with. So like kind of how it looks like there's a lot of, in this piece specifically, you could see the patterns and the different
Yeah.
like colors and lines, like no, how much this portion, how much the red should take up on the bottom and top, and how does that affect the overall like, yeah, composition and size and scale of the piece.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and how the small individual pieces that are woven together are part of this larger composition. So thinking about scale in those kind of relative terms. And I would say that in this case, we would see that the scale of those pieces is consistent. They're all the same size, kind of like a mosaic, or like many kinds of mosaic, where it's typically, the same size of square pieces of glass or ceramic that are arranged, and the kind of effect that that has overall. Um, if this had a figure in it, we might think about, or a couple of figures, we might think about their size relative to each other. So the scale of the figures, and say some figures scale is exaggerated compared to the other, what the artist might be trying to do with that. And then I think we can talk about line in this piece, and we already have a little bit. So there's some adjectives used here like descriptive, expressive, decorative, implied. So let me see if you have a sense of maybe what kinds of, what the line, how the line is used in this work. And we'll build on those thoughts. This one's a bit trickier, I realize. Let's start with an expressive line. So first of all, the way the work is hung in all the three installations we've seen, the lines aren't straight anymore. This is not a grid. But if you can see that if you were to lay this out very evenly without any sort of ruching or draping on the floor, that a lot of the lines probably would conform to a grid because it's woven to a certain pattern, even though we don't have, all the piece like at this top corner and the sides are not precisely cut off at the end of a line. I would argue then that that is a more expressive line. So what is it trying to express? Well, I think that you were getting there when you were talking about how this evokes a more natural kind of environment. Those lines aren't perfect in nature. They're very expressive, they're very organic. And so that's where I think I would start to go with my visual observation of this. I would say that lines are, I wouldn't say they're implied, because part of this work is somewhat of a grid. And so an implied line, I think, would be that, different, maybe more figurative elements like sort of lined up in a way. But that it is perhaps seems a little more expressive than it is decorative. But those are just some suggested adjectives. Now you think about if this is linear versus painterly. What do you think?
Well, I would add that you're having to look at this piece from like two different grids or perspectives in a point, because you're looking at the lines that go horizontally, but you're also drawn to the lines that are like fragments, like the vertical fragments. And so I feel like going horizontally, there are the chunks of colors that are more decorative than others, but I feel like understanding the material of the piece makes it feel very descriptive, or very like, it just makes you think of the gradient of it, like the look, the texture of it.
Yeah.
And that brings like, it kind of mixes descriptive and decorative, but overall it brings like the sense of like linear. I don't think it looks very like painterly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's it is line is really important in this piece. And the fact that this can be arranged a variety of ways, I think shows that it has kind of a foundation in line, but to a certain point, and that it can be used to be a little more expressive, like with these nice curves and drapes. So I think you're on something there. It's not quite painterly, but it's not fully linear, grid-like, kind of rigid or geometric, even if part of its foundation is built in that. Let's think about categories that tend to apply largely to sculpture, although this work is so three-dimensional that some of these are important here. So if we're thinking about mass and volume, we're thinking about how much space the work takes up, the weight of it, thinking about the material, and how much space in the round this would occupy, and also thinking about the texture, which we've touched upon a bit, and how this relates to a particular site. Now, this is the kind of work that's pretty much, his works have been hung in various sites, but they are generally designed, I would say, for this kind of gallery viewing experience with a lot of flexibility. So it's not the kind of work where it's designed to fit one spot in one room in one building. So it's something to keep in mind. But those are questions to be asking. So I hope you see that as we kind of work through some elements of visual analysis together, that it's important to remember how the artist is using the elements of design, things we've talked about, like line, shape, value, color, space, and texture, to create a particular response. And I think you intuited certain responses. You're self-aware enough to think, oh, this is making me think of this kind of natural landscape. So part of that sometimes, as an art historian doing visual analysis, is backtracking a bit and thinking, what is it specifically? And I think you both did a great job. So the next step would be to take these elements, think about what's most important, and or what stands out most to you and leads you to a particular conclusion. So maybe you have a lot to say in particular about composition in this work. Will you take your observations and think, like, what what do these observations lead me to conclude? And that's kind of where you would shift this period of looking into a period of kind of writing and making an argument. And then later on, most art history papers will also involve some contextual analysis. So maybe that's when you look at research about his other works, things like that. And I'll just let you know, artist is Ella Natsui, Nigerian artist, and it's called Fading Cloth, and it's from 2005. So, any final thoughts on this work before I move on to something else? Thank you for your very thoughtful observations and good visual analysis of it. So I wanted to bring in this work. In some ways, there's a lot actually in common with Ella Natsui's Fading Cloth, because we have a larger whole, in this case, pretty large painting on panel, that is composed of smaller parts. So instead of having these little pieces of metal wrapped up in a certain way and woven together, we have little tiny dots composing the composition. And so this is part of the pointillism style. This artist, George Seurat, painted in this way, and he spent about 4 years making this painting. It's a long time. So I bring this in to make a quick comparison, but also to caution you about trying to rely on just your memory to analyze a work of art. Because this is a very, this is a complex work of art, and someone gave me a little gag gift at one point that was a little sticker book with the image of the grass and the water and the trees, but then all of the figures in this image were stickers. And as you can see, I failed miserably at trying to put them back where they go based on my memory. I also went a little crazy. I felt like I ran out of room, so I added some things up at the top. But if you look at these two images, I mean, I was so off. And it shows, even if I've spent time teaching this work, I've spent time in front of it in Chicago at the Art Institute. I've seen it, reproduced lots of times, but given the small test of trying to remember where everyone was, I got this group pretty much right, and this guy, and failed a lot of the rest. I got the little girl right. But it's just a quick cautionary tale that I hope expresses the value of looking at a work of art for a long time, even in reproduction, if that's all you have access to, and taking really good notes. I wasn't really trying to do that, but it was kind of a funny result of a fun exercise that I think said a lot more about how important it is to look closely. You can see here are some images of people looking at this work of art in person, get a sense of scale, but also the range of viewership. Like, this guy is almost touching it, this person's leaning towards it, and then lots of people back, and then here kind of a mix of people in the middle ground and closer and farther away. So I actually wanted to bring in a fun clip from the movie Ferris Bueller's Day Off. I'm going to stop sharing for a moment so I can open up the clip and share that. And oh, it's nice to see you both. I couldn't see your faces before when I was showing the show. So I'll open this up and play. Let me make sure that we skip the ad. Have you both seen this movie? No? Okay. Well, this will be a fun new clip, and then a movie for you to watch at some point. Let me get it right to the right spot. Okay, so first it starts off, just to give you a little context. It starts off with basically the premise of the movie is that this student, Ferris Bueller, is in high school, his best friend and he and his girlfriend skip school for a day, and they just kind of run around in Chicago, and they end up at the Art Institute, and they go and check out some of the art. Okay, can you see the video?
Yeah.
Okay, great. The music's very cheesy, I apologize. Okay. So, any thoughts about what this character Cameron in the red hockey jersey, what maybe he's focusing on, why he's not finding someone to kiss in front of a stained glass window? What's going on here?
I thought it was interesting how they had him being zoomed in on as they zoomed in on the painting, because I thought it was a good juxtaposition. When they zoom in on him, you can see such distinct parts of himself in his face, you know, you can look into his eyes and everything.
Yeah.
The painting, like, I didn't realize when you get that close to it, like, you couldn't even make out her face or anything like that, the little girl.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really striking how little you can see. I brought in some, these are basically just screenshots of the different cuts in this particular scene. And so from filmmaking perspective, it's interesting how much he does, the filmmaker John Hughes does, in like 6 cuts. So first we have Cameron here in front of the work, then we cut to Ferris Bueller and his girlfriend, then Cameron, and then Ferris, and then we're really in here with Cameron, and you notice that it goes back and forth, and we zoom in on both of the characters, and then we get to this point where we see, what are we looking at here in this bottom image?
We're basically looking at the canvas at this point.
Yeah.
Seeing the beads.
Exactly. So it's really it's a really interesting look at a very focused visual analysis. So Cameron's having a bit of an existential crisis, and he focuses on this little girl who is being held by some sort of a guardian, her mother, maybe nanny or someone. But in some ways, you know, she's at the center of this composition. If we go back here, she's pretty much at the center. I mean, the real center is the skirt of this woman, but she's close enough. And she's set out in all white. And so it's natural for his eye, and it's natural for me to remember that she's in the middle, for his eye to go to her. But it also shows that you can't have the whole picture. It's very subjective to just focus on one figure or one element. So that's why we need the whole gamut of formal analysis to get a fuller picture of what's going on in a work of art, especially one that's quite busy like this. But it also shows you how much meaning he finds in just one element of it. And I would say he's thinking about, probably, you know, this is a stretch. He's not going in there to do visual analysis like we would, but I think that he's focusing on the figure, the subject, and maybe even the painting style of pointillism, because we get this sense of it progressing to really nothingness, just seeing the canvas and the dots, as you both said. So I'm gonna stop sharing the slides there. And so I think that you both are really well on your way in visual analysis skills. And do you have any questions about how to apply it?
Well, one, I can definitely relate to how he stares at the art. I definitely stare at art like that as well.
Yeah,
Um,
good.
but I actually recently went to the High Museum here in Atlanta, and being in writing and art history currently, and being introduced to visual analysis and formal analysis, and learning about the elements of art, trying to be in a headspace to visualize art. I know, like, for a lot of methods, the first thing you don't want to immediately jump into visual like analysis. You just want to look at it. You just want to observe it and take it in. And sometimes just like I catch myself like jumping straight into like, okay, this is or at least like when I went this past weekend to the High Museum, I was like, okay, the composition, this is what the texture looks like, these are what the lines are doing.
Yeah.
Like it's you think it's best to not just jump into it so quickly? Like how do you make that transition from observation to analysis?
That's a really good point. And I think that it's kind of like that impulse to to jump in and start identifying things is very universal. And I think sometimes the extreme of that is people saying like, oh, that's Picasso, that's a so and so, and that's all they need to know. They like move on. They don't spend time with the work. And I think that there's something lost there, because the more time you can spend in front of a work without worrying about, oh, I'm trying to remember like if this is such and such an artist and if this is made in this context, in this place, and just appreciating what you have in front of you. At some point, the artist decided that work was done and where they wanted it to be, and it expressed something that they wanted it to express. And it depends on the period and the artist, but there's something of value there of setting everything aside and just looking for a bit. And like you said, not getting too bogged down by feeling like you have a checklist of things to hit, because even though we went through essentially a list with under different categories of what you can analyze, um, that's just kind of to prompt you until this becomes a more natural part of your looking process. So I can't say that after years of doing this, I look at a work of art and say like, I like organically go through the list of composition and line and color, because certain things will stand out to you first and just depends on the work of art. So some, I think with the Ella Natsui, the composition and color were really like at the forefront. But then if we started asking questions about scale and line, then you can see there's actually a lot more going on. So I think it's a balancing act. I think on practical level, if you can just take notes as keeping up with your thoughts, because I think you'll find if you're trying to keep up with your observations in front of a work of art, your brain's working very quickly. So thinking like, oh my gosh, look at this red thing in the corner. Oh, well, look at this line. Oh, this is huge. Oh, wow. Like I need to step back. If you kind of follow like that, that's a great way to take notes. And then later you think, oh, I didn't even think about the scale or the composition, and fill in like that. So I think, yeah, you'll find some balance. And I do think it changes a little bit with each different work of art. It's a good question, though. I'm glad you were able to spend time at the High. Do you have any questions, Gabrielle?
No, I was just here to observe and learn.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I appreciate both of your input very much. Let's see.